Welcome back, everyone, to day 2 of what's already been a most fascinating conference. I've learned so much from all the papers I heard yesterday, and I can't wait to hear more. Just to let you know, this conference is being tweeted, and you too can tweet it. It is hashtag Shakespeare is fit. This joke was written by Jessica Cheever. I mean, it really is the hashtag, but it's also intellectual acuity and fun of Jessica Cheever, and I'm extremely delighted to be introducing her. Jessica studied at Royal Holloway, and she studied English and philosophy, and those are two threads that have run through everything she does. Her doctorate there was on Shakespeare's ontology, and she is now doing another book-length project on Shakespeare's untranslatability. I was lucky enough to meet Jessica when I was briefly running the Masters at Royal Holloway, and when I ran away from there to the Shakespeare Institute, I dumped all my teaching on Jessica, which she very marvellously and selflessly did. How lucky for me that Jessica, a couple of years later, turned up at the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham, with a prestigious Luther Hume Award to undertake her research. And I'm luckier still that in the process of doing that, she put in for a permanent job that we advertised and got it, so that Jessica is now also my new colleague. So I'm very thrilled and delighted to have the honour of introducing her. I'm also going to tell you just a tiny little bit that you should know about Jessica. That is that we had a conference at the Institute, which Jessica nobly attended until she left on the final day to get married. And I'll tell you something else about her and her wedding and her lovely husband. And that is that she was hoping to come here with her husband as a little bit of a honeymoon. But unfortunately, as the husband isn't speaking at the conference, he couldn't get a visa. I could, so I am now having Jessica's honeymoon. Feel free to take romantic photos of us, should you so wish. It's a real honour and pleasure to introduce to you the wonderful Jessica Cheever. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany, or maybe I should say my darling. You've already had a little bit of a taste of my terrible sense of humour in the hashtag, which I did not discuss with Tetsu, so please do not take him to task for my very bad puns and my very bad sense of humour and putting a bit of levity in what has otherwise been quite a serious intellectual endeavour that we've been having here. You've already heard me speak and welcome you, and so I'm not going to go on much longer with my preface, and I'm going to go straight into my subject, which was adverted to a little bit yesterday in some of the questions that we've had at the readings. So I'm hoping that this is already going to be in the area that you're interested in. Now, as Tiffany has already said, I'm interested in philosophy. I've been thinking a lot about nothing lately. You could say that I've had nothing on my mind. That is to say that with a background in philosophy and a PhD which focused on the idea of being in Shakespeare, I've always been interested in the parallel concept of nothingness in Shakespeare. After all, as R.S. White points out, Shakespeare himself repeatedly returns to this concept, clearly intrigued by the teasing philosophical implications of nothing when it comes to refer not only to nothing as an absence, but to a nothing, an existence called nothing, zero. So both mathematically and conceptually, Shakespeare is very interested in nothing, certainly. From Richard II's enigmatic claim, I nor any man that but man is, with nothing shall be eased till he be pleased within nothing, or Edgar in King Lear, saying very strangely, Edgar, I nothing am, instead of I'm no longer Edgar or I'm no longer being called Edgar. These really strange phrasings that Shakespeare uses focus and hinge on this word, nothing. And then there's, even in some of the lesser known plays, Imogen's very despairing but incredibly evocative sense when she finds, or she thinks that her husband is dead, and she says, I am nothing, or if not, nothing to be were better. Now, these crucial experiences of despair and wonder are often expressed through this medium of nothingness, a kind of self-cancellation. In 2019, I wrote a short article for the Routledge Companion to Shakespeare and Philosophy, in which I argued that to be nothing in Shakespeare's plays was often to occupy a kind of lack of social definition, something in between being and non-being. So this is a subject that I've often addressed even before I began work on the more intercultural research that I'm doing now on untranslatability. But it has become relevant in a different way now that my focus is on what might be revealed by those aspects of Shakespeare's work that can't be translated into Japanese. The reason that it's Japanese is because it's the only other language I speak, but it has been quite felicitous that that is the language I happen to speak. Because what better way of studying nothing than through the rich history of nothingness in Eastern thought, in Buddhism, in Zen, in Chinese philosophy, all the things that underlie the Japanese spiritual sense of nothingness. But if I had sought to make the jokes with which I began this paper in Japanese, I would have had much ado about nothing. This is because in Japanese, one must differentiate between nothingness as a concept and the lack of something, and the two can't be conflated and combined into one word. I couldn't therefore have left you to decide whether I'm completely airheaded or that I have philosophical pretensions. I'd have had to make it clear, and thereby the joke is lost. And this doesn't just apply to my rather mediocre jokes. Even the title of Shakespeare's play, Much Ado About Nothing, is traditionally translated in Japanese as karasawagi, or empty clamoring. Though emptiness might be a kind of nothing, the concept of nothing as a philosophical idea is nowhere to be seen, nor is the pun on noting or the sexual pun on nothing as being our genitals. This point might be further clarified through an examination of the moment between Lear and Cordelia when she tells her father that she has nothing to say in his request for an expression of love. Nothing, replies Lear. Nothing, says Cordelia again. And then Lear makes his famous Aristotelian observation that nothing will come of nothing. Speak again. Unsurprisingly, this is the densest use of the word nothing in Shakespeare's canon, with 5 repetitions of 4 lines, or fewer if one counts that as a shared line. In English, Cordelia's sense that she has nothing to say is clearly connected to the philosophical implication evoked by Lear when he says that nothing will come of nothing. As I've already said, that's an Aristotelianism, which is anachronistic because Lear was probably meant to be born before Aristotle. In Japanese translations, however, it's difficult to keep this sense of the philosophical, because Cordelia's response becomes nanimo, or more verbosely in some translations, moshiageru koto. Since the rather all-encompassing term nani in Japanese works like something in English, this response translates roughly to not anything. So Cordelia has not anything to say, or I don't have anything to say in the longer version. It's difficult to convey how this works in English because the grammatical differences make it so that it's not a question of words, but how things are expressed. But neither of these statements contain an explicit negative. The negative is merely implied. Cordelia then states a kind of lack, rather than a word that means nothing. And this lack is not the same as philosophical nothingness, and therefore the transition from repetitions of nothing, of Cordelia's nothing, of King Lear's question, nothing, to Lear's nothing will come of nothing is very hard to achieve. Of the translators that I've consulted in Japanese, only Tsunari Fuda's translation transitions from Cordelia's nanimo to mu, the philosophical concept of nothingness, by having Lear state, mu kara shōzuru mono wa mu dake da zo. A very good translation of nothing will come of nothing, which clearly indicates the philosophical import of the phrase, and which clearly references the accepted translation of the Aristotelian idea in Japanese. But using the translation of the philosophical line in Japanese means losing the continuity between Cordelia's response, nothing, and Lear's philosophical sense of nothing, for which the same word can be used in English. The audience is left to make the connection between Cordelia's nanimon, the lack of something, and mu, nothingness, the more scholarly expression. So in Japanese, the connection between having nothing to say and absolute nothingness is not straightforward. More modern translations tend to favor poetic and oral continuity, and they stick to nanimon throughout. So that in Matsuoka Kazuko's translation, for instance, Lear's nothing will come of nothing becomes nanimo nakereba, nanimo detekonai. Where there isn't anything, no things will come out. And please excuse the awkwardness of this translation here. I can't make it sound more natural in English and retain my point about the difference between not anything and nothing. The effect of the phrase has a way of focusing the matter on the exchange of input and output, the economic sense that if Cordelia will invest nothing, then no profit will come out of her interaction with her father. Like many Asian countries, Japan has a rich spiritual tradition centered on nothingness that is crucial, for instance, in Zen thought, and apparent in the importance of spaces between sounds in music, that is, blank spaces in painting, and readily evident in great Japanese films of the 20th century by masters such as Ozu and Kurosawa, whose films are full of silence and space. And as we heard yesterday, the translators who work on Shakespeare in Japan are interested in the blank spaces of creativity, of what one might make the spaces in between the words that they can insert their own creativity into. Considering the same genre as theatre, in kabuki dramas and no plays, it's often the silence between the line that expresses tension, excitement, and climax. But in Japanese translations of King Lear, Cordelia's response has no way of tapping into this tradition, of expressing the deep connotations of nothingness that even Lear suggests in his response, nothing will come of nothing. To those of you who don't speak Japanese, it's necessary to explain why, when there is a word for nothing that is mu, that's not the word that Cordelia uses. The main reason is that while mu does mean nothing, it can't be used as a vocal response to mean that one has nothing to say. It's more like nothingness with a capital N, and you can't, even in English, if Lear asks Cordelia for a response, she can't exactly reply nothingness. That would sound very odd. It's partly the difference between a colloquial response and a scholarly concept, both of which are expressed and encompassed by that single English word nothing. But the difference between the scholarly and the colloquial is also, in Japanese, a difference between spoken and written language. Although the gap between these two forms of common communication has lessened considerably in the last 2 centuries due to active government intervention in the language actually to match spoken and written forms in Japanese that started in the late 19th century, there is still a considerable gap between the written and the spoken in Japanese, which has to do with the history of language and its importation on the Chinese writing system over a millennium ago. To those who don't speak Japanese, let me explain this as briefly as possible. Because Japanese kept its own grammar and speech but used Chinese characters to write, every Chinese character has a phonetic reading, kango, which is closer to Chinese, and a so-called meaning reading, which is the Japanese spoken form, or Yamato Kodoba, which has been attached to the Chinese character. In the particular case of nothing, the Chinese phonetic reading is a philosophical concept, mu, and the Japanese reading is nai. So if you say nani or nai, then there is nothing there. The nai is a negation. In most cases, one does not use the phonetic Chinese reading in spoken Japanese except in compound words, just as one doesn't often use those Latinate polysyllabic words in everyday English communication. But the reason for this is not just that it sounds a little bit pretentious and strange, but because many characters in Japanese have the same phonetic reading, leading to very confusing homophones that you can't tell apart in spoken language. This also means, though, that certain ideas are easier to write about than to express in verbal ways, and vice versa. As Maynard Senko observes, Kango vocabulary, that is the Chinese characters, is larger, and its relatively precise and analytical quality makes it a suitable means for expressing abstract thoughts. Yamato Kotoba, that's the spoken language, is more appropriately used to express emotion and feelings. Different discourse genres use varying levels of mixture of these two types of vocabulary. Casual speech, for instance, shows restricted use of Kango, while an academic thesis uses Kango more abundantly. Because conceptual issues are easier to convey in Kango in Chinese characters, that can be combined as well in different ways. Philosophy is definitely one of the subjects that tend to be conducted more in writing than in the spoken word in Japanese. Now, I may have appeared to have digressed somewhat from Shakespeare, but this differentiation of the spoken and the written language has some obvious and serious implications for the translation of drama, which is primarily a spoken form. It means, for one thing, that philosophical connotations are more likely to be dropped for the more readily comprehensible spoken terms that the audience can actually understand when the actor expresses it. So many Japanese translations will drop references to nothing, such as when Ophelia responds, "I think nothing," to Hamlet's question, "Do you think I meant country matters?" before the staging of the murder of Gonzago. And also Hamlet's incredulity that the player could cry, "All for nothing, for Hecuba." Well, there is often no nothing in the translation, which becomes, for instance, "all for no reason." Matsuko Kazuko actually doesn't even translate that phrase, she drops it entirely. In Odashima Yushi's translation, it's an "all for no reason." While Japanese and Asian philosophical traditions ought to provide us with a rich field from which to approach the question of nothingness in Shakespeare's work, Japanese translations of Shakespeare, then, have no easy way of retaining that philosophical potential of Shakespeare's nothing. This question of the translatability or untranslatability of nothingness does interest me. My concern is less actually to do with the untranslatability of individual words that can or can't be translated, because that can be a bit of a dead end, and it can just be a small focus, and actually if you end up talking about that, then no word is adequately translatable. I'm interested in what these little moments, what I will call speaking untranslatables, might tell us about Shakespeare, in Japanese and in English in this case, and about the ways that we can express things. Because what can and can't be said in a certain language gives some indications about the assumptions underlying a language. And language, while it doesn't completely control the way that we can think, does guide us in certain ways and make certain forms of thought easier to express. Nothing is an example of a word that Shakespeare can use without difficulty, but which is not readily verbally expressible in Japanese, as I said, in spite of its centrality to Japanese thought, and that's quite interesting. Now, examining the reason behind this difficulty in Japanese might reveal something crucial about how Shakespeare uses language and how and what it can signify. Partly because the spoken word is less suited to expressing complex ideas in Japanese, but also because of the dominance of Buddhist traditions that value implicit communication and the ability to sense meaning without being told. And because the Buddhist tradition has a sort of distrust of human communication because it's incomplete and limited, there is a long tradition in Japan of denigrating speech and of idealizing silence. In fact, those of you, as I was saying, who were here yesterday will have heard some people say this, that one of the comments was that we Japanese are more keen on blank space. I wrote that down verbatim when I heard it. And also, very memorably, Hamlet talks too much. As Patricia Fancy claims, the Japanese have little faith in verbal expression or in those who rely upon it. And there are a multitude of proverbs, and proverbs are very interesting cultural markers, that testify to this commonness of this teaching. So to give just a few, there is Igen Shinra, which is beautiful speech is not truth. Iwanu ga hana, to say is not the cloud, which sounds weird, but more literally means it is better to leave things unsaid. My mother tells me this all the time, because here I am, talking an awful lot about not talking, and it means the mouth is the gate of trouble. The stereotypical image of that laconic samurai who doesn't say very much, or the stoic Japanese male who grunts and speaks very little, is in keeping with this tradition. And the heroic depiction of such individuals in popular culture still suggests the romanticization of this stoic silence. As one might notice from this association of masculinity with silence, there's also a gender dimension to this ideal. Speech is considered frivolous, effeminate, the less said the better. There is a famous anecdote about Natsume Soseki telling his student that Japanese people don't say, I love you, that's unnatural, and why not translate the phrase to something like, the moon is beautiful. The truth of this tale aside, it's true that tender and direct expressions of this sort have no place in traditional Japanese speech, and one can see that the unstated implication of the moon is beautiful, that the beauty of the world is enhanced by this shared moment of seeing the moon together with somebody you love, avoids direct statement in favor of poetic circumlocution that relies on the listener's interpretation of one's meaning. Even when there is speech, then, rather than silence, Japanese language tends to leave much unsaid. And this is partly a grammatical thing, because any and all elements are left unsaid as long as what is unsaid is assumed to be understood or unnecessary. So you can, in Japanese speech, you can cut out nouns, verbs, and particles. And especially in speech, one tends to omit these things that one shares with an interlocutor. So where in English you would have to say something like, are you feeling cold? In Japanese you could just replace it with the verb cold, say, samui. And the questioning implication of that will give you the idea that I'm addressing it to you and that I'm asking you whether you're feeling cold. You don't have to say the full sentence in order to convey what you mean. So what's unsaid, the implied aspect, is just as important as what is said. And because Japanese can be pared down in this way, there's a strong cultural belief in the unspoken. At its most extreme, the belief is that, especially among those to whom one is closest, communication should not be necessary. That the ultimate goal is a kind of telepathy, ishin-denshi, literally heart-to-heart communication based on shared understanding. And there's this sort of traditional image of a married couple who don't say anything to each other, and it's not because they hate each other, they just don't need to say anything. So the more the shared knowledge, the less need to be explicitly stated. The need to speak, then, on the other hand, suggests distance and unlikeness. According to Takiya Sugiyama-Lebra, belief that the truth lies only in the inner realm as symbolically located in the heart or belly. Components of the outer self, such as face, mouth, spoken words, are in contrast associated with cognitive and moral falsity. Truthfulness, sincerity, straightforwardness, or reliability are alike to reticence. Thus, a man of few words is trusted more than a man of many words. So sincerity belongs to the heart and is silent, where flattery and insincerity is located about the mouth. Although it is undoubtedly true that Japanese communication relies on the implicit to a significant extent, I'm not actually claiming that the Japanese live up to this ideal of stoic silence, and those of you who are not Japanese, I'm sure you've noticed that there are just as many chatterboxes in Japan as there are outside of Japan. Any generalization about how the Japanese are as a collective cannot stand up to scrutiny. And it is almost certainly true that the veneration of silence has declined in the last few decades, with changing ideas about masculinity and the increasing popularity of Western media, which brings Western ideas about self-expression. Nevertheless, it is true that respect for silence remains a spiritual ideal and a social ideal as well, and an ideal that the Japanese associate with themselves, that is, or ourselves, and part of that too. And this idea that one ought to be silent, can still reveal much about how communication can occur. The principle of silence continues to influence what should be said and what should remain unsaid, for instance, especially among the older generation and intergenerationally. And since silence is associated with sincerity, overt expressions about one's thoughts and feelings are generally not appropriate, especially in public, but also among one's closer acquaintances. Sorry, especially in public. Among one's closer acquaintances, one can generally express one's thoughts quite freely without consequence. It's a phenomenon that the Japanese psychoanalyst Takeo Doi refers to as a relationship of dependence, as Amahe, that there's a lot more that's forgiven between those who know each other in Japan. But even between people you're close to, it is unusual for someone to express their feelings at length, a sort of this is how I feel. You might express your thoughts more than your feelings. Now, Haruo Tsutsumi illustrates this very well in her play Kanade on Hamlet, which is about a fictional kabuki troupe trying to perform Hamlet in 1897. Unable to understand the play, and especially the soliloquies, the actor playing Hamlet asks, "Truth to tell, I don't understand feelings. What's Hamlet thinking anyway?" So to speak what we feel and to be understood, one requires a cultural and linguistic framework in which it makes sense and is appropriate to speak in that way. And what does this have to do with Shakespeare? Unlike the modernist drama of Ibsen or Strindberg with Pinter and Beckett, but even in comparison to many other early modern writers, Shakespeare is verbose, full of characters who express their feeling to each other in soliloquy and at length. One might add spaces to Shakespeare, one might cut down the text, but it is not a drama of silence and action. Because if you wanted to add spaces, as the late Peter Brook did in his film version of Lear, for instance, one has to cut the play significantly. The densely verbal nature of Shakespeare's play means that on some level, their form of expression is alien to Japanese people and will remain so. And that was quite interesting yesterday as well, that it was mentioned that Shakespeare is in some kind of Shakespeareanese that is not actually very Japanese. There's something about it that remains foreign to Japanese people. So however well translated, Shakespeare will always remain foreign because the characters talk about themselves. They soliloquize their feeling, they discuss with each other, they argue. They don't act like Japanese people, they don't speak like Japanese people even when they're speaking Japanese. To go back to Cordelia's answer, nothing, then, the problem is that she says the word nothing instead of saying nothing. Although she says that she will love and be silent, her nothing is not silent at all. I might add that for all she says that she can say nothing, she actually says quite a lot to explain her position. And this was a puzzle to me when I first read King Lear, because I found it difficult to understand why Cordelia needed to speak aside to the audience of her intention to say nothing. Even the more self-consciously verbally reticent characters in Shakespeare can say quite a lot in favour of saying very little. And the full sense of the English nothing may not translate into Japanese, but it's also very difficult to translate Shakespeare's effusive nothing into actual nothingness and silence. And I'd like to stress that I'm not claiming that Japanese is unique in its idealization of silence and distrust of language. And actually, as I was thinking about this, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that early modern England shares with Japan this idea that silence is preferable to speech. Certainly, Shakespeare's work is full of proverbial recommendations of silence, as when Polonius advises Laertes to give thy thoughts no tongue, advice that another parent, the Countess in Oswald the Enfield, gives to her departing son, who she tells, be checked for silence, but never taxed for speech. These recommendations are not necessarily just about social appearances either, because as Enobarbus reminds himself in Antony and Cleopatra, the proverb is that truth should be silent. Just as the tongue is not to be given free rein, silent truth is located in the heart as well for Shakespeare. As when Troilus complains that Cressida's letter is words, mere words, no matter from the heart. Or when Coriolanus asks, must I with base tongue give my noble heart a lie that it must bear? As in those Japanese proverbs that I read earlier, the heart is associated with truth where the tongue lies. Thus in Sonnet 17, Shakespeare writes that if he describes the beauty of the young man, the age to come will say, this poet lies. Such heavenly touches never touched earthly faces. So should my papers yellowed with their age be scorned like old men of less truth than tongue. And your true rights be termed a poet's rage and stretched metre of an antique song. The tongue is the organ of falsehood, as something that can conceal truth. The abundance of words, then, cannot be trusted. The poet evinces a sort of nervousness with the form that she develops untruth because of the medium in which he writes. That as long as he is writing in words, then people might distrust his tongue. Indeed, for Iago in Othello, it's this very separation of the inside and outside, heart versus tongue and faith, that allows him to act a part. For it is not just virtuous truth, for it's not just the virtuous truth of heart, but treachery that can be unreflected in outward appearance, as he famously declares. When my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart in compliment extern, 'tis not long after, but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve with doors to peck at. I am not what I am. Even in a character as false as Iago, the heart is still figured as the house of truth, in this case, the truth about his falsehood. It's a body part which cannot be fathomed, just as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern cannot pluck out the heart of Hamlet's mystery. And the gender and sex disassociation of women in the book is also expressed by Shakespeare's characters, as in Julius Caesar, and Brutus's wife Portia prays to constancy to set a huge mountain between my heart and tongue, claiming that she has a man's mind but a woman's might, and lamenting how hard it is for women to keep counsel. Once again, the dichotomy is between heart and tongue, a separation harder apparently for women to keep. As Hamlet also seems to claim when he exclaims in self-disgust, "Why, what an ass am I! This is most brave that I, the son of a dear father murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must like a whore unpack my heart with words, and forward cursing like a very drab, a scullion. Fie upon it, foe!" Not only is excessive speech and emotional expression feminine for Hamlet here, it's sexually profligate and low. It's something that whores do. As Gail Pastor theorizes in The Body of Varus, there is something leaky, it would seem, about the female body, something incontinent about the mind that will be spoken. And the falsity of language, the inadequacy of utterances, arises time and time again across Shakespeare's canon, across genres and amounts of characters who cannot be more different from one another. And part of this is no doubt that Shakespeare simply uses the expressions and the idioms of his time, but as an actor, a playwright, and a poet, and as the sonnet quoted earlier partly indicates, there can be no doubt that he writes with an awareness of the limitation of words, and the disconnect between heart and mouth. For it is the domain of actors to speak words that do not belong to their hearts, and to cry all for nothing for Hecuba, if required. In the plays, the self-conscious and comedic irony of working on a medium that one distrusts comes through in such moments as Weiler's conversation with Festig, who quips that a sentence is but a shadow of love to a good wit, how quickly the wrong side may be turned outward. But who refuses to explain what he means when he says that words are very rascals and slums disgrace them, because he can give no reason about words. And words are grown so false that I am loath to prove reason with them. To one who works in words, the criticism of words can only ever be a contradiction. A consideration of the difference between saying the word nothing and saying nothing, the untranslatability of what each language may consider an appropriate response, has led me to the suggestion that Shakespeare and his society appear to have similar notions about silence, truth, and fallibility of language as I have attributed to Japanese. However, a brief comparison will suffice to show that Shakespeare's response to this fallibility is significantly different to the Japanese advocacy of silence. As I suggested earlier, Japanese silence is based on a foundation of trust, a shared basis of understanding that means that one can rely on what is implicit without any explicit statement. In other words, though silent, there is still communication occurring. The silence is a kind of non-verbal language. Though it is presented as an alternative to language, it does not transcend language. It is actually still a language. Shakespeare, on the other hand, shows a similar distrust of what language can do, but exhibits no confidence in any unspoken language one can fall back on in silence. When words fail, language fails. The language of silence is no more reliable than the language of words in Shakespeare. And to return to Cordelia once again, it's no wonder that she's stuck in the awkward position of having to say the word nothing instead of saying nothing. She says, "I am sure my love's more richer than my tongue," and tells Lear, "I cannot heave my heart into my mouth," drawing once again on that dichotomy between heart and tongue. But her very need for explanation gives away the fact that there is no implicit understanding between her father and herself. And because the inadequacy of language While Cordelia explains herself in words, it is difficult to distinguish her from Goneril, who also tells Lear, "I love you more than words can wield the matter." The ironic fact is that one must use words to claim that words are inadequate or false. Kent might try to remind Lear that thy youngest daughter does not love me least, nor are those empty-hearted, whose low sound reverbs no hollowness. But while the proverbial ideal remains or appears to be silence and truth, as a character made of words in a play of words, there's no place for silence in Shakespeare's plays. One might think of the violently silenced Lavinia in Titus Andronicus, whose story cannot be conveyed, nor silence understood. Language is certainly unreliable, and in King Lear, it's what fools both Lear and Gloucester. But while silence might be associated with truth, it's evidently not enough to communicate the truth. While there are similarities between the Japanese distrust of language and Shakespeare's, then, Shakespeare more thoroughly deconstructs the possibility of communication. Though, as Feste points out, there's an irony to the fact that the falsity of words cannot be explained without words, I suggest that it is precisely Shakespeare's method to use words to reveal the limitation of words, not through explanation, but by making use of the very instability of meaning. And Samuel Johnson famously remarked that a quibble was to Shakespeare the fatal Cleopatra for which he lost the world and was content to lose it. I'm inclined to think that Shakespeare's propensity for puns, quibbles, and wordplay are not just delight and playfulness, not just a temptation of a wordsmith who enjoys our goes, but also a kind of disrespect for stable meanings. Far from being the golden apple for which he turned aside from his career, multiplicity of meaning is a way of pushing up against the formal limitations of language by forcing words to signify multiple things at once, thus proliferating potential meanings and therefore by exposing their instability and destabilizing meanings. Instead of turning to silence, then, Shakespeare demonstrates a distrust of words by using words, revealing a fundamental cynicism about language and communication. So although he works in language, his uses of language are dolphin-like, showing above the element they lived in. There may be similarities in the skepticism about spoken language in both Japanese and in Shakespeare's writing, but this response to this skepticism is diametrically opposite. One might say that the Japanese lack of trust in the verbal manifests itself in a sub-linguistic way, where Shakespeare's is metalinguistic. Now, I propose this conference with the hope of finding something that translation will reveal about Shakespeare, and this is still my goal. But it may be objected quite legitimately that one doesn't necessarily need translation to find out Shakespeare's self-reflexive questioning of the medium of his own art. And I know that people have already talked about Shakespeare's distrust of language in Western criticism as well. Skepticism about other minds and about communication is also a relatively big field in Shakespeare studies, especially in Shakespearean philosophy, to which even academic philosophers such as Stanley Cavell have contributed. And critical theory has deconstructed language in Shakespeare for years. But while native Anglophone speakers do have privileged access to Shakespeare's words, a monolingual person can only ever see such words and phrases within the paradigm of the same language. A polyglot has a very different viewpoint from a position in between languages, which can give a sense of a sort of reflexivity about the languages one speaks. As Tsubayuki points out, different languages divide reality differently. And of course, even a multilingual person is not outside of language, that's why I say liminal. Because, as many philosophers have contended, it's not possible for humans to be outside of language. But to be able to move from one language to another, and especially to be a translator, is to be in a liminal position between languages, a position from which the peculiarities of different languages can become manifest. As Shakespeare scholars, we are specialists in Shakespeare's choice of words, his expressions, his poetry, and any discipline that might give one an insight into such words must be valuable. As I have been contending, however, it is not just Shakespeare's words that come into focus when one considers the untranslatable and the difficulties of intercultural understanding beyond particular words. It is the very nature of communication as lived by Shakespeare, the gaps between the words, or the instability of the layered words that test the very language on which we rely. Without generalization, I can claim that communication is fundamental to humans, and all forms of communication are language, verbal or otherwise. The contrast with the ideal of silence in Japanese highlights the very verbosity of Shakespeare's plays and in turn reveals Shakespeare's concern with the efficacy of language, a language that he pushes to the limits of signification. Translation and the difficulties, if not impossibilities of translation, are widely treated as a question of intercultural understanding, which they most certainly are. But such moments of interculturality also have the power to show the things that one takes for granted about intracultural communication, the styles of communication that predominate, the ways in which one can speak in one's own language. For instance, in a linguistic culture where silence is not an effective language. To return then to the word nothing, if nothing, with its mundane to its philosophical meaning, cannot be translated very easily into Japanese, into a language in which nothing might more readily be expressed by saying nothing, then it can still prompt a reconsideration of what it means to say the word nothing, of how one might communicate lack, how Shakespeare, in his verbal drama, staged those moments in which language must be used to transcend language. Translation is communication, and looking at Shakespeare through translation is to consider what it means to communicate, how Shakespeare staged the failures of communication, those moments when saying what we mean, not what we ought to say, is not enough. Indeed, a consideration of nothingness and silence might alert us to the fact that in order to think about language, it is not enough to just look at the words alone, but what happens between the words, the nothings and the silences, the gap between thoughts and words and deeds. The rest is silence. But what does that silence mean? Thank you very much.
Thank you for an extraordinarily rich paper, ranging over the philosophical meaning of nothing and what it is to translate. Can I open this up to questions, please?
Thank you, Jessica. That was very intriguing. And, I was quite, intrigued by Ophelia's silence. She lovely expressed herself by saying nothing instead of keeping her silence. So I'd like you to comment on the first scene in Midsummer Night's Dream, in which Hippolyta keeps her silence, and Theseus is very perhaps upset by her silence. And at the same time, also I'd like you to perhaps something different, but I'd like you to say something about nothing. Titania doesn't say anything. She keeps her silence about the changeling boy she has been deprived of. But Shakespeare does not let her say anything about that before the play ends. So would you please comment on that 2 points?
Yes, thank you very much. That's actually a very good point, and one might actually think of the other very famous silences, like Isabella at the end of Magical Measure as well. There are moments of silence like that in Shakespeare, it's true, and I think that the critical commentary around those silences goes quite a way to show that those silences are not understood. And they are puzzles for Shakespeare's scholars. And I think that's quite fascinating, that Shakespeare does also use a kind of silence, that it's not just through his language, and I think I need to think a little bit more about that. But it's not like the Japanese silence still, because it's not a silence that's understood by people. As you said yourself, Theseus is frustrated with Hippolyta's silence. The silence is a sort of refusal to communicate rather than a means of communication, and it doesn't give away any truth. And that's part of the reason why it remains a puzzle, I think, for Shakespeare scholars and anybody who's interested in Shakespeare at all. Thank you, that's a really good point.
you so much. That gave me so much to think about. It was so polished that I'm very happy that I'm here to hear this. I loved that much ado's title translates to empty clamoring. So they've got the idea of speaking and hearing and sound. And it made me think of two instances in the play immediately where they've just put Hero and Claudia together. And about the gendering you were talking about, and the question is, why would you think that Hero's cousin Beatrice is prompting her to speak in his ear? And, tell them something so she's being prompted to speak. And at the same time, when Claudia is not saying anything in that play, and he says silence is perfect as herald of joy, a lot of critics seem to think that that is a statement that's not acceptable. Like, he's not being sincere in that moment, and if he was, he'd say something. And to me, that opens up some very interesting things about gender. Silence, I wonder what you think about that.
Yes, I think that idiom about silence is an expression of joy. But I wonder whether part of it is a sort of a cultural disjuncture, a culture shock between early modern England and modern England, in fact. Because a lot of these proverbs that I've been picking out of Shakespeare are not idioms that are very widely known in England now. I don't think that many people will be able to readily tell you that England has a culture of silence. So it makes sense that just because we speak the same language, it doesn't mean that we share the same cultural assumptions as Shakespeare's time. I mean, that's something that a lot of historicist scholars have been pointing out for quite a long time now. So if a scholar doesn't understand that maybe there can be something sincere about Claudia's silence, then maybe they need to look at the rest of Shakespeare and realize how he uses the silence or implications for silence in his other plays. I think that you can take that as a reasonably straightforward recommendation of joy in Claudia. But the gendered aspect of it is also complicated, especially in Much Ado About Nothing, because that's a play about a woman who speaks an awful lot as well. And so I think that you could probably, I've not done the work, so I'm saying you could probably have a look and see whether there is some sort of irony involved in telling a woman to speak, or whether there is a way in which the play itself is actually playing against those notions of how genders should be, or whether it is actually better to have a silent woman. Because I'm sure that Beatrice is presented as a very delightful character by Shakespeare, and she talks an awful lot, and a lot of the female characters who are well loved by the audience, and it seems that Shakespeare gave a lot of time to a women who speak and speak well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. It's a very fascinating speech, a talk, and I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. Anyway, you introduced this interesting example of nothing as that brings out the difference in cultural attitude towards language and Japanese attitude towards language and everything. Can you think of some other example that you have been working? It doesn't have to be about Japanese or, it doesn't have to be Japanese English. It can be some other Shakespearean expression that might.
Well, of course, because I've been working on untranslatability, and this is one of the chapters in a book that I'm writing, I have come up with some other untranslatables, which are those speaking untranslatables that I've been talking about. The most famous one is, of course, the to be or not to be speech. I've got an article coming out in Shakespeare Survey next year, which is on the untranslatability of that and what it reveals about certain assumptions about existence in Shakespeare. The other one is pronouns, in fact. And I think that has to do with what I was saying about what can be dropped in Japanese, what doesn't need to be said, and about how that reveals certain ideas about a culture's understanding of individuals. So because Japanese has so many pronouns, but also because in Japanese you try your best not to use pronouns at all, there's a kind of self-abnegation involved in that, which is very different to the focus on individuality, which is almost compulsory in English because you can't say things without saying I or you in English.
Thank you. Very interesting.
So when you were talking, I kept thinking about Derrida, but also about Benjamin. So who wrote in his task as translator. Translation is not about communication, it's not about the intention, it's not about the reader. Right? It's about something else, it's about pure language. So what do you think is the task of the translator then?
That's a very difficult question.
I'm really sorry, but I'm really interested in your take on that notion.
Yes, I do have a lot of respect for Benjamin's essay, which has been shared a little bit too much without the rest of Benjamin's thoughts, I think. But also, while I think there's something very evocative about his idea that there's something pure conveyed by translation, that somewhere in between languages there's thought is the kind of idea, I think, there's a kernel, a spirit. It's interesting that you mentioned Derrida because there's a big difference there between Benjamin with the completely opposite directions. That Benjamin has quite a lot of centrist view of how translation works. I think while I really like Benjamin and I've written quite a lot about Shakespeare and Benjamin, I incline more towards Derrida when it comes to translation because I think that there is something more to do with communication, but also that there is something more useful about Derrida's way of thinking about translation and about the importance of language in between languages, of what those moments in between language and the repetitions can tell us about human society in general, which is not about reaching for an ultimate truth, but about finding the shades of meaning.
Okay. Thank you for your profound presentation and a very rich paper. In your presentation, you focus on the concept of translatability, and you focus on the words and phrases of Shakespeare's play. But in the case of English-Chinese translation, we translators in the Chinese language, they found that the most difficult part to translate are actually word plays instead of just simply words, and also puns. So I'm curious about the condition in English-Japanese translation. Is that the same? That's my first question. And my second question is about your concept of untranslatability. Is that possible that something is untranslatable for some translators? However, other translators might be more able. So those difficult untranslatable things might be translatable for the other translators because they are more professional, more well-learned, or well-trained. Okay, that's my second question for you. Thank you.
Yeah, as for puns, yes, I think that is the internationally accepted, hard to translate aspect. You might want to keep that question for tomorrow when we have some translators of Shakespeare who are going to be giving presentations. They'll be able to give you some better examples. But yes, puns are very, very hard to translate in any language because they rely on intertextual aspects and puns rely on lateral thinking that are embedded and encoded in language and also to do with sounds. But as for your other question, I'm looking at professional translators, people who are extremely proficient on what they can't translate. So the question of skill doesn't really come into it. I'm more interested in untranslated, so that wouldn't be untranslatability, that would just be bad translation or less good translation perhaps. Untranslatability has various different definitions. The most obvious one is the idea that there are words that can't be translated into another language. And strictly speaking, I don't think that is an untranslatable. Often these words that can't be translated into another language just means that there isn't a word for word thing that means exactly the same thing. It means that you can't actually explain what you mean by the word. So the sort of untranslatable that I'm interested in is not what's normally referred to as untranslatables. It's not word level. That is, while I'm looking at nothing, I'm looking at a conceptual idea or even the grammatical conditions that make certain language thoughts and expressions possible. And that's more fundamental. That's not something that the individual skill of the translator can do anything about, because you have to change language entirely in order to make that happen. So one thing, for instance, in response to Dr. Ashiz's question just now, I said that being is one of those things that can't be translated into Japanese. And it's true that to be can't be translated into a verb that means exactly the same, to be, in Japanese. But it's not just that. It means that when I say a sentence like, there is a cloud in the sky, is a conjugation of to be. In Japanese, there is none. There is no to be involved in a sentence of that kind. That means that on a fundamental grammatical structure, there are certain words that are not fundamental, that are not part of the very web of the language, and therefore that verb to be does not have the same significance, and cannot have the same significance as in most Western languages that hinge on that verb. So yes, that's a very good question. There are all sorts of ways of thinking about untranslatables, and I think that there are benefits of looking at just word level things too, but the more profound observations can probably come from a better understanding of untranslatables in the wider context of language.
I think it is now time for us to take a break. This rich question session has revealed what a profoundly interesting paper that was, and it certainly made me think afresh about the stage direction. He holds her by the hand, silent, because Shakespeare can script silences. I hadn't really thought about that before. So actually saying the word nothing, and I think there might be a nothing not thing to be gone into, and a sort of zero thing that's really interesting to Shakespeare. But at this stage, I just want to congratulate you so much for a really excellent paper and a great start to this morning. Thank you.